Hey everybody, what's up? Just Ehren here, Question Period Canada. It's a crazy snowstorm here in Nova Scotia. Everything's shut down, like even some pharmacies and stuff like that are shut down. So it's pretty wild. I guess it was our turn and it's supposed to continue to snow all day today and into tomorrow. So just hoping we won't lose our power here. Something very interesting we'll be covering in this video, though, is we're going to be looking at Trudeau's testimony from the inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act, which it's been determined they were guilty. But this guy, I'm on to him. Like, he's not a good liar. He just does it a lot. And so we're on to him. And I think when we look at his testimony from back then, it's from November of 2022, that we're going to see that he's just full of it. That's pretty much the message that we need to get out to Canadians, that when you watch what Trudeau's doing, he's sneaky. And we do have videos after we watch the testimony, which will be take quite a bit of time. We do have the Liberal cabinet rejecting the decision, saying like how quickly they're going to appeal and how correct they still think they were in using this act. It doesn't make me trust the government anymore. So we're going to have to jump straight in and we'll start checking out this testimony. It shouldn't take us very long to get started. Here we go. This gentleman's walking up to the stage, so we'll get some.
Order allowed. Order allowed. The Public Order Emergency Commission is now in session. La commission sur l'état d'urgence est maintenant ouverte.
Okay, good morning, bonjour. So we're at the last day of the public hearings on the facts. There will be, of course, the public hearings on policy matters. Alors, c'est la dernière journée pour recevoir les faits pertinents. Et évidemment, il y aura la période de politique la semaine prochaine. So, I think we're ready for the next witness, Commission Counsel.
Shantona Chaudhry for the Commission. Our next and final witness is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, well,
these things are always slow to get going, hey?
maybe we'll take a few minutes. I'm not sure where the process is, a bit anticlimactic. So
They will get Justin in the chair
I think
here.
we'll take 5 minutes then and see, and you can come and get me when it is. Thank you.
The commission is in recess for 5 minutes. La commission en avait pour 5 minutes.
It's always a clown show when the government's involved, guys. Always.
It's just a bit of a false start. So, nothing to do with your appearance. You're welcome to come in, obviously.
And then they kiss his
happy to
butt.
get started.
He was late.
Can the witness be sworn or affirmed?
Mr. Prime Minister, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
J'aimerais le faire sur la Bible, s'il vous plaît.
Pour les fins de procès verbal, s'il vous plaît, veuillez indiquer et ensuite épeler votre nom en entier.
Oui, j'affirme. Et Justin Trudeau, Justin-Trudeau.
Jurez-vous que le témoignage que vous allez rendre devant la commission sera la vérité, toute la vérité et rien que la vérité, que Dieu vous mène en aide?
Je l'affirme.
Merci.
Merci. Merci.
Just before we get started, there, as I understand it, as you heard, there will probably be some testimony in English and some in French. So please, if you need translation equipment, you should have it at hand. Okay.
Good morning, Prime Minister.
Morning.
Thank you for being here. So we'll start with the routine housekeeping. You recall being interviewed by Commission Counsel on September 9th of this year?
Yes.
Okay. And after that interview, Commission Counsel prepared a summary of your interview.
Yes.
For the record, we don't need to call it up, Mr. Clerk, but it's WTS.5084. And Prime Minister, you reviewed that summary and you can confirm that it's accurate to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Okay, and I'll add there that, of course, it's a summary. It's not an exact transcript of your words, but it's a prepared summary, and we're all aware of that. So, Prime Minister, as you know, you are the final witness to testify before the Commission. So at this point, the Commission has heard a lot of evidence about the events of January and February leading up to your government's decision to declare a public order emergency on February 14th. But what we haven't heard yet is your perspective. So your own perspective, your viewpoint, both as the Prime Minister leading the country through these events and the decision maker in the government's ultimate decision to invoke the Emergencies Act for the first time in that act's history. So we have 2 hours together this morning, and I anticipate that the examination is going to proceed in 2 parts. The first part will consist of fairly specific questions taking you through the chronology of events, often with reference to documents that have been adduced before the Commission, readouts of your own calls. And the second part will consist of some bigger picture questions, so addressing some of the key themes that have arisen out of these events and the government's response to it. So let's start with the chronology of events, and I'll warn you, we're going to fly through this pretty quickly. 2 hours is not a lot of time to fly through everything that happened between these days, but if ever you feel like you need to add in some narrative or explanation, please feel free to do so. So we'll start with just the pre-arrival days, so before the convoy arrived in Ottawa. We know that you learned the convoy was on its way a few days before, maybe around January 24th, and you were briefed on it by both officials from PCO and your own staff from PMO. Can you recall what your expectation was at that point? So you've been briefed, the convoy is on its way. What did you anticipate was going to happen?
Mais on avait vu pendant les mois qui ont précédé un niveau de frustration et de dissatisfaction avec les politiques gouvernementales par rapport au mandat, par rapport à la vaccination. Et on avait entendu de la rhétorique assez corsée de la part de plusieurs personnes à travers le pays. C'était un reflet aussi de ce qu'on avait vu pendant la campagne électorale qui s'était passée 6 mois avant. Alors, de voir que ces groupes allaient venir manifester à Ottawa, on s'attendait un petit peu au genre de rhétorique et à l'intensité qu'on avait vue, mais on a régulièrement des manifestations à travers le pays. On est vigilant, on est attentif, mais on se prépare dans la mesure du possible.
Okay. Vous avez parlé de la campagne électorale. Pouvez-vous dire un peu plus sur ce sujet?
Bien, la campagne électorale avait été un moment où on a pu consulter les Canadiens directement sur les mesures qu'on voulait amener pour protéger la santé publique, c'est-à-dire spécifiquement des exigences de vaccination pour quiconque voulait embarquer dans un train ou dans un avion, ou bien travailler pour la fonction publique fédérale. Et c'était des gros enjeux, une grosse décision de limiter l'accès au transport fédéral comme ça. Donc, pour moi, c'était important que les Canadiens puissent se prononcer sur cet enjeu-là. C'est sûr qu'on le faisait ancré dans les recommandations de santé publique, dans le désir de garder les gens en santé, en sécurité, mais je pense que c'était tout à fait approprié qu'on ait des débats robustes à travers le pays sur ces enjeux-là. Et c'est exactement ce qu'on a eu pendant les élections. Il y avait plusieurs partis qui étaient en faveur de ce que nous, on proposait. Il y en avait d'autres qui étaient farouchement opposés. Et les Canadiens, pendant cette campagne électorale, ont pu se prononcer. Mais ce qu'on a aussi vu, et ce que moi et mon équipe et mes candidats ont vu en particulier, c'est un niveau de manifestation, de frustration et d'agression, au moins d'intensité d'émotion par rapport à cette campagne-là, par rapport à ce que nous proposions, qui était pire et plus intense que tout ce qu'on avait vécu dans d'autres campagnes électorales ou dans d'autres événements politiques. Donc, on voyait qu'il y avait une intensité potentielle qui était là pendant la campagne électorale, qu'on a vu à quelques reprises dans les mois qui ont suivi et qu'on soupçonnait s'en venait peut-être à Ottawa pour ce convoi.
Okay, so just to sum that up, and I'll switch back to English. I think we'll probably be switching back and forth a few times. You saw the protest coming and you've been briefed on it, and as you said, Ottawa's used to dealing with big protests, but there was maybe a hint that something could be a little bit different here. So there was a hint of worry there. And then, of course, we know that the convoy started arriving on the 28th and then went into full swing on the 29th. What was that first weekend like when the convoy arrived from your point of view?
Well, first of all, one of the things that we noted in the run-up to the arrival was a bit of a disconnect between what the sort of political arms of my office were seeing and expecting from what we'd seen on social media, colored by our experiences from the campaign that was only a few months before, contrasted with the assurances by whether it was Ottawa Police Services or even the public service, that this was just a normal, quote unquote, style of protest that we see on the Hill fairly regularly. And there was already a little bit of worry that this might be a different brand of event than Canadians were used to seeing. And we certainly saw during the first weekend that the expectations that the police had said that they would simply go home, the ability to keep it under control was not exactly there.
Okay, and I think starting on that Sunday, you made a few calls to various MPs in your Ottawa caucus, sort of checking in and seeing how people were doing, because there was a level of concern there. So on that note, I'll ask Mr. Clerk to please pull up ssm.can.nsc402813. While that's being pulled up, it's a readout of a call that you had on Sunday, January 30th with Yasser Naqvi. Just for the benefit of everyone in the room, can you tell us who Yasser Naqvi is?
Yasser is the Member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre.
Okay, perfect. So if we can just scroll down to the text here, Mr. Clerk, there we go. So, hey Yasser, how are you, PM? How are you doing, and how are folks in the community? And Mr. Naqvi says, very dire. Community feels under siege. You can imagine number of trucks, rigs, honking. For them, it's a party, but they forget it's also a neighborhood, especially low-income families. I've been getting a lot of feedback. Also been in touch with Marco, that's Minister Menachino, Bill, I assume Minister Blair, and local officials, finding ways to make sure these folks are not part of residential streets. Tonight will be challenging. And you say, I feel so gutted for so many people who are just in such a difficult situation. It's not just disruption, but there's a lot of hateful rhetoric going on. Are you seeing some of that? And Mr. Naqvi says, it's unbelievable. The images that we see are hard to believe. Saw a life-size poster on a truck of Hitler and your name underneath. This is the kind of grossness our country is subject to. I have constituents being yelled at for wearing masks while out doing normal chores. there are all kinds of issues people are facing in the neighborhood. I don't know if they can sleep at night. And you then reply, there doesn't seem like much clarity on how long this will last. And then you refer to an incident at the Shepherd of Good Hope. And then finally, your last comment here is, I'm so sorry, my friend, this is just horrible. The RCMP is concerned, everyone's on eggshells. Having this going on in our nation's capital is just totally irresponsible. So to some extent, that's self-explanatory, but I'm wondering if you can
up,
help us a
everybody?
little bit in explaining
chance to say
the
hello to
context of
everyone.
that call and
Angry
what Mr.
Canadian,
Knox was
Brent,
referring to and what
see
you'd observed
Greg,
yourself.
tinfoil hat.
I
saw
dare say
Kerry.
that citizens of
yeah,
Ottawa
it's
are
great
used
to
to
see
political
everybody.
activity and protests.
We kind of have to
on
watch
the
this
Hill,
stuff
on a
because you
range
won't
of
forget
things.
once you see it.
But this was present and in their
He's so smug
daily
and annoying.
lives and disrupting their weekend in a way that wasn't a usual political protest. From the intimidation and harassment of people for wearing masks to a very concerning story about folks disrupting the nearby homeless shelter and soup kitchen. There were indications that there was a level of disregard for others that unfortunately we had seen examples of during the election campaign. And it emphasized for me that this was the same kind of thing that we had seen, the intensity, the anger, the hateful rhetoric.
Okay. Moving on then, Mr. Clerk, to the next document, ssm.can.nsc402812. So, Prime Minister, this is moving on to the next day. So that would be Monday the 31st.
Michelle, what's up?
I think at some point there was some hope or expectation that the convoy might disperse by Monday, but it didn't. And at that point, you have a call with Mayor Jim Watson of Ottawa. So we'll just look at a couple of things here. The
He's
initial
just a
reference is
sociopath.
to a
He
press
can lie
conference you've
to
done and
anybody
tells
at
you
any
hit it out
time.
of the park, hit all the right notes.
I can't be like
and
that.
then says these people had their time and need to move on. So he's very, and he's trying to get this across to the chief of police, be Chief Slowly. So Mayor Watson is obviously very focused on putting an end to the protest if he can. Scrolling down then, that last bit, JW, that's Mayor Watson. Chief of Police said it's so volatile, but kept under control so far. Trucks are starting to leave, but the diehards chained themselves to this. It's unfortunate for people living in the neighborhood. Chief of Police spoke to Chief Lucky, and we need a few more sources. I think that probably means resources, and you say that's for sure. And then it goes on. He says,
That's true.
more.
Hey,
We have to do this with a
Canadian.
sense of balance. These guys are just
They
looking
told the
for a
truth at one
fight.
time.
And your comment
get away
back
with lying there.
on that, just down a bit, Mr. Clerk, is the remainders will have no choice but to incite as a counterbalance. So we all have to be careful. Can you explain those last few comments and the balance and counterbalance you were referring to there?
Yeah, can you scroll back up to okay, no, just keep both Jim's line and mine on the screen. There we go. Yeah, I mean, these calls were very much about me understanding what's happening from a local
He's a psycho.
sense, and there was expression in this that there were some people who were more intense in the protests than others. Some were just along to be part of something that they agreed with. Others were really shaping it and driving it, and I think. I believe, I'm not entirely sure what I was saying there. I'm not sure the transcript is exactly right either, but it's enough. This sense that we didn't want to further provoke, but we need to be firm in standing up for people. We need to encourage people to leave, but if they see that the numbers are starting to dwindle, the ones who remain will be more intense. So there's a sense already that as we manage this, we have to be careful. We want to make sure that we support and protect people living in the city, that we're allowing for life to get to normal despite this protest, without inciting any reactions that amplify the thing further.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. The next one, Mr. Clerk, is ssm.can.nsc 402814. So now we're at Wednesday, February 2nd, and this is a call that you have with Anita Vandenbeld. So again, can you tell us, Prime Minister, who Anita Vandenbeld is?
Anita is a Member of Parliament for Ottawa, Nepean East, or I believe that's it. Anyway, she's just to the west of downtown. She's a longtime MP and a very strong community member of Parliament, and she was expressing here just how the tone of and the tenor of this. What was going on in the neighborhoods and around people was worse and more hateful and different from anything she had seen before in a number of years as an MP, but a long time involved in political engagement.
So we'll take a quick, not a quick break, but just drop in here for a minute, because like I think that Trudeau's a lot of like has a lot of poor characteristics, but I don't think he's stupid. I think that one of his things that he is good at is never answering a question and managing to get away with it, because the way that he dodges a question, for whatever reason, he never has to answer a question. And there's very few politicians that pull it off, not with the grace and style that he does, because the way he does it is like smug and obnoxious, but he still manages to pull it off. I find he's a dangerous guy because he has some skill. He didn't get to where he is just by being stupid and just by being a puppet. Like, to be a puppet in a powerful position like that, you can't just be stupid. Maybe you can. I don't know. I'm not sure.
So you remember this call?
Yes, I do, very much.
He's
Okay,
full
so we'll
of
just
it, though.
read
We
through
know
a
that.
little bit of what Ms. Vandenbeld said. Starting there, you say, I wanted to check in, how are you doing? She says, I really appreciate it. I'm torn, I'm scared, but I get really mad that I'm scared. Kids with autism, the noise, it's one of those things you feel like it's okay, well, it's awful. I'm not a stranger to volatile environments, but it's different because I know the sentiment is directed towards us, you particularly. There's this hate for liberals. And then after that, I do think it may deter some young women looking into politics. I don't want anything to happen to one of us, God forbid you, before we start thinking about all of this. And then she speaks about constituents calling about what the PM is going to do about it. It's hard, and she says it's hard because I know it's not within your purview. People are frustrated and they just want somebody to do something to get the city back. And then she speaks about some other hateful messages that she's observed. And you say, it's about how you balance it again, being responsible and reasonable. So the part of this that I'd like you to speak to, Prime Minister, is where she says a lot of constituents are calling me about what the PM, what the Prime Minister is going to do about this. And she then says, it's hard because I know it's not within your purview. So what does that refer to?
That actually refers to one of the challenges and things that we were struggling with from the early days of the pandemic, of the convoy occupation, which is that because they were very visibly most motivated to protest the federal government and federal government policies, even though many of the mandates they were actually vocally concerned about were provincial measures, but it was very clear that they had targeted Ottawa and the seat of our federal government deliberately, that it was a federal protest in a city that houses the capital. There is an impression and an expectation that therefore it's it's the federal government's responsibility to deal with it, to make sure that it goes away, to stop it. There is a general expectation, even by people who are longtime residents of Ottawa, that this is somehow like Washington, D.C., that is a separate enclave where the RCMP can give out traffic tickets, which they don't. But there is a blending of orders of government in protection of
Listen
Parliament
to this
Hill and
answer.
Precinct.
Like, makes no
that
sense,
led a
but he's
lot of
getting
people to
away
say,
with it.
well, they're
Like,
here, they're angry at the Prime Minister,
if he
they're
was talking to
disrupting my
me, I'd
neighborhood.
be stopping him and being like, that's not what we were
The federal
talking
government should
about.
really do something to get rid of these protesters or move them along or have them leave. Where we were continually explaining, as Anita said, it's not in our purview, the management of Wellington Street, of neighborhoods around was the jurisdiction of the Ottawa Police Services. And if they needed support, the OPP and then the RCMP could be providing extra supports, but it was their jurisdiction. But of course, anyone who's involved in politics, you can be a federal MP walking through your riding and someone complains about garbage pickup. They don't want you to hear you say, oh no, that's not a federal issue, that's municipal. They say, thank you, I'll make sure we pass that message along, we'll try and see sure that gets fixed. The idea that I was saying, this is not a federal policing issue, this is not a federal issue, this occupation, this is something that Ottawa Police have jurisdiction need to take care of. For a lot of people, sort of say, well, like, see, they're here because of the federal government, and the federal government is refusing to do anything about it. Was the kind of blending of narratives that we had to be really careful about.
I think we're going to come back to that when I start asking a bit about Ontario's initial response to all of this, but we're not quite there yet. So I'll take you a few more things, and then I'll ask you to pick up where you left off there. So far, we've been looking at some calls you've had with your own MPs from your caucus. The next one, Mr. Clerk,
sorry guys,
pull up,
that
it's
started blasting.
ssn.can407738.
Is that under control? Someone let me know.
Excuse me, on February 3rd, Candace Bergen, who I believe had just become Leader of the Opposition in the House. I confess I was yesterday years old when I learned that, but I now know. Okay, so this is a call you then have on Wednesday, February 3rd with Ms. Bergen. And do you recall this? Do you remember this call, Prime Minister?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and can you tell us what inspired that call, or?
It was mostly a congratulatory call when someone becomes leader of a political party that sits opposite us in the House. I tend to reach out and have a bit of a personal conversation. I usually ask after family, see how they're adjusting to it, to maybe give some recommendations.
Hi, Fred
trying to get enough sleep.
Hi, Justice
But
Warrior.
I
Hello,
try and
everybody.
keep it
I mean to say
human
hello to
introductory
everyone.
call, even though I had
Always.
engaged with her many times in the House over the years as an MP. When she became leader, I wanted to reach out and establish that personal contact. Of course, it was all happening in the context of this occupation going on, so that was part of the discussion, but primarily it was a congratulatory call.
Okay. Get enough sleep is always good advice. Mr. Clerk, can we scroll down a little bit?
Yeah, I don't trust the Trudeau though, man.
see.
But I can't
There we go. Okay.
say
So
that
this
he's
is the part
just
of the
stupid
conversation
and
that,
lucky.
You start talking about the security situation
He's
in
a
Ottawa.
threat.
You say the second set of briefing would be security situation in Ottawa right now. Obviously of real concern, and we have lots of disagreement on causes and path forward. I would certainly like to make sure you're getting
ASW,
briefings
what's
on
up?
safety and the situation and have you at least fully informed. Hopefully, we're all going to be able to make sure Canada's democracy continues to run and our institutions remain strong, and quite frankly, the citizens of Ottawa get back to their regular lives. Scroll down again, please, to the next page, Mr. Clerk. So Ms. Bergen says, absolutely, I agree. I'm sure you weren't following question period today, but that's what I'd like to see, some resolution. You're right, we disagree on some things, but I would agree with you. The goal is to let's find a way for people to head back home and clear things up in Ottawa. We do want the same things. If you have some ideas or some things you think could be done, extending an olive branch is one way of putting it. We'd love to be able to work together to make that happen.
Hi,
All of us,
Cinderella.
and you say in reply, all of us need to focus on getting the temp down, the temperature down, and getting people back to normal lives. Let's ensure there are discussions on that, and there may be opportunities to work together. Some of them, and I think you're referring to the protesters there, have jammed themselves into a corner, and their acts are non-starters. We have our democracy and our institutions. That is well worth defending. There are ways we can get beyond this. I'm worried about setting a precedent where if anyone wants something, they can set up a blockade on Wellington Street. People need to be heard, and that's part of our democracy and getting that balance right. And Ms. Bergen says she agrees with everything you've said. I think that you do have to be cautious. And as PM, you don't want to set a bad precedent. I'm sure you're talking and coming up with some ideas, and then she offers to help. So the part of that I'd like you to elaborate on is, it appears there that you're talking, and I take it the olive branch is a suggestion of some engagement with the protesters.
Just watch how he does this.
Talking
He
to
won't answer a
in
damn
whatever
thing.
capacity that would end up
Watch.
being. So what comes out of this conversation that you have with Ms. Bergen, and what was in your mind at the time?
I say, we have ensure there are discussions on that. Let's ensure there are discussions on that was very much, let's make sure as political parties we keep talking about it, figuring out how we can work together. And then, some of their asks are non-starters, like overturning the results of the election that we just had. But in terms of responding to their demands or legitimizing them by engaging, I'm highlighting that I'm worried about setting a precedent that a blockade on Wellington Street can lead to changing public policy. People need to be heard, but we need to get that balance right. And then she agreed that I need to be cautious and I don't want to set any bad precedents.
Okay, so fairly self-explanatory. There's a willingness to discuss, but you were concerned about setting a precedent where a blockade could equal a change in public policy. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think we have a robust functioning democracy, and public protests are an important part of making sure we're getting messages out there, and Canadians are getting messages out there and highlighting how they feel about various issues. But using protests to demand changes to public policy is something that I think is worrisome.
Okay.
That's the point of a protest, though.
So thank you, Mr.
Although,
Clerk.
sorry,
We've got to back it
please go
up.
on.
We've got to back
protests,
that one
if you're
up.
out protesting that the government, public protests are an important part of making sure we're getting messages out there, and Canadians are getting messages out there and highlighting how they feel about various issues.
So confusing.
But using protests to demand changes to public policy is something that I think is worrisome.
Okay.
I mean, see, that is just, if we
thank you, Mr.
focus
Although,
just on
sorry,
that.
to a certain
No,
extent,
please go on.
Protests, if you're out protesting that the government is, shutting down a safe
just caught
injection
himself.
site or something, you are asking for changes in public policy. But there is a difference between occupations and saying we're not going until this is changed in a way that is massively disruptive. And potentially dangerous, versus just saying, yeah, we're protesting because we want
You can protest, but only
public policy to change, and we're trying to convince
within our
people to
rules
get
of the
enough of them. The
protest.
politicians will listen to enough people saying, okay,
Get the Liberals
I'm
to
gonna lose
organize
votes if
the
I don't change
protest.
this. That's the usual way protests can be effective in our democracies.
Okay, that's a fair point of distinction. Thank you.
it's just tough
Mr.
to
Clerk,
watch
the
angry
next
Canadian, like,
document
because
is
like,
ssm.can.nsc
it is, like, I'm not really that wound up, like, but in the moment,
So,
yeah,
Prime
it's hard
Minister,
to
we're now
watch.
heading into the second weekend of the protests, so Saturday, February 3rd, and our understanding is that the protest intensified again with more trucks coming into Ottawa. And on that day, on the Saturday, you have a call with the Governor General, Mary Simon. Do you remember that call?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so here is the readout of it, and we'll just go through or quite a bit of actually what was said on that call. So again, there's the introduction, and you say it's been stressful, not so much for me personally. The Governor General says, yes, they seem reluctant to give it up also, makes it challenging. And you say, yep, people blame the feds, but many of the mandates are not us. And for the police, well, we don't direct them. Trying to get this resolved as peacefully as possible. Want them to find a way to save face, but they can't shut down our democracy. Sorry, they're trying to pull you into this
He is
also. They just
special.
don't understand the institutions. And then the Governor General asked to go further on that. Actually, I'll stop there. Do you remember what you're referring to in that paragraph there?
Yeah, that was I believe it was a memorandum of understanding that some groups within, or some group within the protesters had declared that what they wanted was to empower the Senate to work with the Governor General to create a provisional government or appoint a government committee that would change public policy, and displayed a lack of understanding of how our democracy and our institutions actually work.
Okay.
But I mean, it also meant she was getting bombarded. The Rideau Hall, which is filled with good people giving out medals to worthy Canadians, were bombarded constantly by demands that she fire the Prime Minister, and in a very, very aggressive way. And that's what I was referring to as tough for her and tough for her team.
Understood. And is that what prompted this call?
Could have been part of it, but I also speak regularly with the Governor General just to check in, and obviously this was something that was worthwhile checking in on. But yes, that was probably the reason.
Fair enough. Okay, so then she asked if there's any sense on how it will be resolved, and you say something, and then now they're starting to do that. Bill Blair has handled a lot in the past, and we know we've heard a lot from Bill Blair at the commission as well. This is not a protest, more an occupation, hard to diffuse. It will take time, being very careful to not try to fix something we don't have the tools for. And then there's some discussion of the funding. Can we scroll down a bit, Mr. Clerk? Onto the next page, please. And then the Governor General says, yeah, there's some of the senior staff getting a lot of hateful emails, asking for the Governor General to fire the Prime Minister and to create these crazy things. It's difficult to receive these things. They made a website in my name saying stuff. I have to let it slide off our backs, and then you discuss the security situation. So is that where you were just referring to, Prime Minister?
Yes.
And the sort of bombardment? Okay.
Imagine being the Prime Minister and being insulted
What was your sense of where things were at on that
one of your
second weekend?
voters? Imagine.
The first weekend caught everyone by surprise. Through the second weekend, I think I mentioned it in referring to Bill Blair, talking with the local police with his own expertise and background, talking about things that can be done to try to de-escalate, to start putting an end to this, understanding that it can't happen overnight, but that there are things that should be done. There was an expectation or a hope that on that second weekend, we would see a decrease in activity and a dwindling. Instead, we saw a surge on that second weekend, and things that we had heard that the police were going to start doing this or doing that, and we're going to be able to respond, didn't seem to be materializing. There was a sense that the occupation was just continuing full swing without any real control or even plan to end it. And I know from conversations with MPs and others that the citizens of Ottawa were quite frantic about having to go through a second weekend of horns and disruptions and being yelled at for wearing masks and not being able to go to their neighborhood stores,
the rights of
Rideau Centre
Canadians,
shut down, and all these different things that were
freezing their bank
really
accounts,
problematic.
jailing them.
And people were starting to get pretty upset that this was
Beeping
two full
horns,
weekends that they were being massively disrupted by.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Take that one down. So speaking of getting a little upset, the next topic I want to address with you is Ontario's initial response to the protest in those early weeks. So one theme that's emerged from the evidence we've heard, and we've seen several references to it in the documents, is your government's frustration and your own frustration with what might be characterized as a certain reluctance on the part of Ontario to engage, especially in the tripartite tables that Minister Blair, I think, had put together. So, Mr.
Minister
Clerk,
Blair,
can you pull
right?
up ssm.can.nsc
Tired.
402837? This is the readout from a call that you had, Prime Minister, with Mayor Jim Watson on February 8th. Excuse me. Okay, so just keep scrolling a bit, Mr. Clerk, past the key takeaways onto page 2. So just to stop there, give a bit of situation. So Mayor Watson here brings up the expression whack-a-mole, which we've heard several times in the commission. It's fighting a losing battle. We don't have enough police. And you reply that, well, that's entirely right. I know we're looking carefully at that. We're looking at the resourcing. And then you say on the Ottawa policing side, you've seen, as I have, some concerns on how things were handled from the beginning. And then you ask about
He is a
Mayor Watson's
nutcase.
relationship
He's
with
just
the
not a
police chief
stupid
and how
nutcase.
they're
He's
working
effective
together.
at doing what he
And
wants.
you observe that there are moments
Like,
where Mayor Watson is saying one thing and
I want to just
the
call
chief
him
is saying
stupid,
another, and
but
ask
it's
if there's
not
anything you
just
can do about
stupid.
that. So just briefly before we go on, can you comment on that a little bit and the Ottawa policing situation to the extent that you were briefed on and aware of it?
One of the things we'd said from the very beginning to the RCMP and to the Commissioner of the RCMP and to government in general, that if there was anything we could do to support the Ottawa Police Services in what they were doing, if we had resources or abilities, because there is a federal presence in this capital city, we should do it. That we were there to be helpful. I instructed Brenda to try and do whatever she could to send support to the city of Ottawa. What we got back, or what we had heard, as I recall, were different numbers from what the mayor said Ottawa needed to what the police chief was saying they needed. And the one thing that the commissioner made clear to me was they needed to know that if they were deploying resources, that they were going to be appropriately used, that there was a plan for that. And we see it sometimes in requests for assistance across the country, where someone will say, we need 20,000 police officers, or we need the military to come in with 1,000 troops, or we need this or that in RFAs. And part of our due diligence is, okay, what do you need them for? What are you going to be doing them for? Because, for example, if you're sending in military, as we did in Hurricane Fiona, to help clear power lines, as was necessary in Atlantic Canada, in no situation do military members engage in policing activity. And there was a sense that maybe they could be directing traffic. And we have to make sure, no, they're not police, military isn't there to play police roles. And that's why we always have questions that, okay, we're going to send resources, but we need to know
send it in the military when we have
how
this
they're gonna be
other
deployed.
military.
And there wasn't always that clarity around what the plan was, how many they actually needed, how they were being used, and how they were, where they were going to be best deployed.
Okay. Just keep scrolling down, please, Mr. Clerk. I'll tell you when to stop. Keep going, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I missed it. There we go. So Mayor Watson says, I'm going to ask after this phone call whether the federal government will live up to its commitment. We need boots on the ground very shortly. It's not dying down. It took over Metcalfe Street, blocked all of it. And you reply, listen, yes, you can say the federal government will be there with more resources. But again, the thing that frustrates me, and everyone is conflated, but Doug Ford has been hiding from his responsibility on it for political reasons, as you highlighted. And I suppose it's important that we don't let them get away from that. We intend to support you on that. And Mayor Watson replies, if they keep dragging their feet, I'm happy to call them out on it. It would be nice if we got something firmed up with the federal government to shame them. Ford didn't even make an effort to come and see what's going on. So can I just ask you, Prime Minister,
There's
to
probably
comment
some
a bit
truth
on
behind
the
that,
politics
though.
that are going on there?
Who knows?
Well, first of all, when I say everyone is, I believe is conflating, it was conflating, a protest of federal issues with a federal responsibility to do the policing that would dissipate that protest. So that was, a little bit of an interplay that there was a sense that in the initial phases of the protest, the Ontario government was happy for the perception to be out there that this was a City of Ottawa issue and a federal government issue, and that as a province, they really didn't have a responsibility or a jurisdiction to play in there. It was an unpleasant situation. There were bad headlines. I was getting grumbled at by citizens of Ottawa every day because the federal government wasn't dealing with it.
Grumbled at?
I can understand that provincial politicians who were being overlooked in the complaints everyone had about why this wasn't getting resolved would say, you know what, let's not poke our noses into this, and people will continue criticizing those people that help. I'm fairly certain that behind the scenes, the OPP was engaged with Ottawa Police Services and was providing supports as we were as a federal government. But I think at the political level, there was probably a decision to continue to stay back a little bit and let us wear it a little bit. What we had seen during the pandemic and during other crises is when the three orders of government are able to work seamlessly together. Not only does it deliver better results and better coordination, but it actually reassures citizens to see that people who are not always politically aligned at the highest levels can roll up their sleeves and work for the benefit of citizens. And that's certainly something that I've always tried to do, and I've been able to do with Premier Ford on many, many issues. But at this point in the evolution of the occupation, that wasn't something that we were able to do. And so, yes, there was a bit of frustration about it.
Okay, well, and we'll see that the very next day you had a call with Premier Ford, and just in the narrative, what was going on at this point is, in addition to Ottawa, and there were a few things, as we know, going on across the country, but by this time, the 7th, 8th, 9th, the Ambassador Bridge blockade had really heated up and was in full swing, and that seemed to be a turning point in several ways, but certainly for Ontario's participation in all of this. So, Mr. Clerk, if you can take that document down, please, and bring up ssm.can.nsc 402845. So, point for advocacy, to make a long story short, this is a call where it seems that you and Premier Ford are engaging and deciding to work together to solve this problem at this point. We can skip over the first, here we go, the last part of that first paragraph. So PDF, Premier Doug Ford. He says, what we can recommend and what we can work together on is I've asked our AG, our Attorney General, to look at legal ways to give police more tools and exhaust legal remedies, because the police are a little shy and I can't direct them. So that's one area we can focus on. We can't take their polar licenses. We checked that. We can shut down their fuel consumption and cordon off highways. That's where we're at. And
Might be operator licenses.
yeah, probably not polar, but operator licenses. Let's go with that. So then you reply, first of all, they're not a legal protest.
I think you're right,
They're
Brent. I
occupying
think more
a
people
municipal
are
street
turning
and
on
are
them
not
every day.
legally parked. You shouldn't need more tools, legal tools. They're barricading the Ontario economy and doing millions of dollars of damage a day
think you're
and
right
harming
about that too,
people's lives.
Greg.
At a time we're trying to draw in investments, a whole bunch of people are looking at this and saying, we can't even clear up a protest on a bridge. So just stopping there, Prime Minister, do you remember what you were referring to when you start talking about you shouldn't need more tools?
I mean, that whole question around
Stroke.
legality or illegality of the protest.
Like it's a coin
they
toss.
didn't have a permit to protest. They not certainly as long as they had. They were illegally parked. They were
Emergency Act,
engaged in
throwing people in jail,
disruptive activities.
freezing bank
There are
accounts,
any number
double
of
parked and
municipal
they
and
didn't have a
provincial
permit?
bylaw infractions and legal infractions that they were engaged in by
Bylaws.
just being there. And there is a sense that, and this was based on an earlier conversation I had with Bill Blair about how one proceeds in this,
Bill Blair's the voice of reason.
you can enforce
Can't tie
small
his
things
shoes.
as a way of keeping the situation under control and creating boundaries and balances and moving towards it. It's an approach. The issue here was that there were things that they could do and things that I know were tried that they realized were unsafe for them to do. There are stories of police officers getting swarmed there when they tried to arrest someone with a jerry can filled with gasoline. There was a sense that, giving out simple tickets wasn't really having much of an impact as they did that, and taking stronger measures was going to be resisted and met with significant resistance. But these are things that if they feel they didn't have the resources to enforce a prohibition on bringing in jerry cans or a prohibition of parking on the approach to the Ambassador Bridge, well, let us give you more resources to do that. Between the OPP and the RCMP, we should be able to get the numbers up in a way that could lead for an ability to use those existing tools on the books.
Howdy
That was
chance.
very much where our thinking was at that point. Like how many more police officers, how much more resources do you need to get a plan? And if there was a concern around, we can't get those police allocated to us from other jurisdictions unless there is a clear plan, well, we'll send you planners. We'll help get those people there so you can establish a plan that will allow itself to be deployed. There was really a sense that there was
It's my pleasure,
more
Chance. I
things
love
that
doing
could
this
be
stuff.
done.
We've grown a
And
community here. It's
seem to
fun.
be agreeing.
Okay, and
We have
that's actually
more
what you end
people
up
that
saying
I'm
in the part you
recognizing their
can't see
names.
right
It's
now with
fun.
that,
People that
the next
are
page
interested in
paragraph.
change.
I'm at least consistent.
It's fun.
So, you say the Bridges and Tunnels Act means the federal government has something, I can't read that anymore, but the federal government has responsibility over the bridge and border. So there's a role for us to play. We're happy to play it, but nobody can get on the bridge because they're on municipal land being blocked. So we'll give you whatever resources you need. The police of jurisdiction need to do their job. If they're saying they can't do it because they don't have enough officers or equipment, we need to remove that excuse as soon as possible so they can do their work and we can prevent Ontario from becoming a laughingstock. Mr. Clerk, just scroll down to the last page, please. We'll skip over, there's some jurisdictional discussions going on there. And then just at the top of that page, please, Mr. Clerk. So this is the sort of the conclusion of the conversation. You say, what are the next steps? You've said the OPP are going in. Are they keeping you apprised and do they understand the urgency? They can't talk this out for 3 weeks. They need to act immediately. And I'm assuming there the concern of acting immediately is brought about by the situation on Ambassador Bridge, which we heard a lot about from the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday. Premier Ford replies they'll act, but without directing them, it's hard to describe their game plan. They'll have a plan, unlike Ottawa, where they didn't have a plan. I'll get briefed tomorrow from the Solicitor General, would keep you updated. This is critical, I hear you, I'll be up their ass with a wire brush. Then the next, you say, yes, that's one of the quotable quotes of the commission. There have been a few, that's one. The next, your reply there is, well, we're there with resources. Bill Blair will coordinate on our side. You can reach out to LeBlanc, Minister LeBlanc or me. You and I need to work together on this. People will be reassured by the two of us working together. We need to demonstrate this is not a place of lawlessness. Okay, we can take that down. Thank you, Mr. Clerk.
I will say, though, that
I'm sorry.
they can't talk this out for 3 weeks. They need to act immediately. I wasn't just talking about the Ambassador Bridge. I was talking about Ottawa as well. I was talking about the fact that this simply can't continue to be stretched out this way. But when I say they need to act immediately, obviously, I'm not directing the Premier to direct police. We know all the limitations that we have, but there was an expectation that this was a situation that was going on for too long. And as Doug pointed out a couple paragraphs later, there is a sense that the police of jurisdiction had lost control and wasn't able to control the situation.
Okay, that's fair. Yes, I took the document down before we got to Ottawa, but that's right. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. That one come down now. So shifting gears away from Ontario, we understand that there's a lot of concern coming at the federal government from the United States as well. And again, the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday spoke about the many conversations she was having with stakeholders in the U.S. officials, Brian Deese in particular. And we understand that on, I believe, February 11th, you ended up having a phone call with President Biden. Mr. Clerk, we'll just pull up the readout of that call. It's PB.CAN 6057. Okay, just scroll down to the next page, please. So, maybe that's there. It's got to be somewhere. Keep scrolling until you see your readout, but in the oh no, there it is, I think. In any event, Prime Minister, can you tell us, just the readout doesn't actually say that much, so can you tell us about your recollection of that
This is
call?
from November 25th, 2022.
Two goals I had in that call. The first one was to reassure him that despite the disruptions to trade and real impacts on both sides of the border, which were economic, yes, but were also people to people. We knew from the pandemic that thousands of healthcare workers cross the Ambassador Bridge every day from Canada to go work in Detroit in their hospitals. There are real meaningful connections across that crossing that were being disrupted in meaningful ways, and I wanted to reassure President Biden that Canada was going to be able to solve for this, and that we were going to continue to be a reliable partner for trade and for people-to-people ties and a safe neighbor. That was sort of in response to his concerns around disruptions to activities on both sides of the border because of the blockage. But the second thing I wanted to talk about was just sort of the general context, the fact that the 911 center being overwhelmed in Ottawa a couple of days before happened from American calls, that there was a significant amount of amplification from certain sectors of the American politicosphere. And there was also a significant amount of money flowing and support for these occupation activities in Canada that were coming from people in the United States sympathetic to that cause and opposed to both he and I in our public health policies, but also in our general policies.
Okay. And would you say that President Biden shared your level of concern about the situation?
No.
How would you be able to tell?
I think I was much more concerned about the blockage to the lives and the disruption and the potential security concerns. I think he was very concerned, but I don't think anyone was more concerned than me.
Okay, fair enough. It was happening on your side of the border, so that makes sense. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. That's it.
The press don't like him. Like it seems to always break his heart.
Pretty critical time.
Still, I see that in
the
him.
narrative of
when they ask her say something mean.
February, so we're building to a bit of a crescendo around that time, the 10th, the 11th, and we've heard from the clerk of the Privy Council that on February 9th she advised you to convene the incident response group. And the first meeting of the incident response group was then on February 10th. So we have heard quite a bit about the different cabinet committees and what the IRG is, but I'm wondering if you can tell us from your perspective, sitting as Prime Minister and chair of these committees, what it means to convene an IRG and how it differs and what it gives you, what advantage it has versus other structures.
regular cabinet committees are chaired by members of cabinet and feature various cabinet members sitting around the table, assisted by their directors, their deputy ministers. But they are discussions amongst cabinet ministers on a particular issue that will then go to full cabinet. That's what most committees are. The IRG is a special committee, special in that it is chaired by me. It doesn't have a permanent membership because we deal with incidents that require or are important for the federal government to respond to. These could be floods or hurricanes. The most recent IRGs I've had have been on the situation in Haiti and how Canada can respond and support. We had them around. Have them around all sorts of different things, depending on what they are needed for. We pick the areas of expertise we want around the table. But differently from most committees, these are meetings in which the officials sit around the table and are not just expected to participate, they actually lead the discussions. Whether it's deputy ministers or heads of agencies, the commissioner of the RCMP, the director of CSIS, what have you, they are giving direct reports. Ministers are usually, if not always, there as well. But if they speak at all, it's at the very end to add a little bit of color or further input. IRGs are all about making sure that the government as a whole is hearing directly, that I am hearing directly from all these different agencies and all these different inputs into whatever incident we're looking at. And then we establish a plan or we move forward on that. It's actually a decision-making body. We can make determinations about what we do next, but that frame is fairly unique amongst our committee structure.
So it collapses that layer between the officials and the ministers a bit, so gives
we hear
access?
Directly from the ministers, which is sometimes something that cabinet ministers who are used to getting briefed by their officials and then briefing their colleagues takes a little bit of getting used to. When we have a different IRG on a different subject with new ministers who aren't usually at IRGs, it always is a little adjustment for them that no, we're hearing from their deputy minister, not from them. It's about informing us, but it's also about making sure that everyone is on the same page. One of the challenges in any government is the siloing that happens. Something that happens in public safety doesn't necessarily get connected to transport, doesn't necessarily get connected as organically as we'd like to immigration and various things like that. So making sure that everyone's around the table, getting on the same page in terms of what's happening with this incident that we're looking at and what we're going to do about it. And there's usually here are the taskings we're going to do. Let's check back in a few days and see how we've done and see where we are again. IRGs rarely happen on a sort of a one-off. There's usually a series of them until the incident is over or has been moved to.
He's using his hands a lot. I think when he's deep in a lie, he gets animated. Because he's in Parliament these days, he's dancing around all the time.
You convened to deal with
because
this
the lies are more outrageous.
First of all, 3 times before invocation, and then I think I met daily after that, but we're going to focus on that first part on the 10th, the 12th, and the 13th. And I'll just fill in a little bit of the narrative so you don't have to here, but we understand that on the 10th, what was discussed was 2 tracks for a potential federal response. So at this point, I won't say it had been decided, but it was certainly under serious consideration that the federal government might have to act in some way, shape, or form here. And track 1 was what can the federal government do under its existing authorities? Track 2 was what could we potentially do under any new authorities, including the Emergencies Act. And I just want to pause here and ask you one thing, which is in the documents, that sort of maybe not the first, but it's certainly the first sort of confirmation, official confirmation that the Emergencies Act was under discussion. But we have seen references to the Emergencies Act here and there in various phone calls or emails or discussions, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you can describe, if someone asked you, when did the Emergencies Act come into play as a possibility? How would you answer that?
Oh, as an idea, it would have been from the very beginning in the back of our minds. As you see a situation that is an emergency, is out of control, has a potential for real impact on citizens, potential for violence, real concerns about what's going on, not just in Ottawa, but right across the country. At the Coutts blockade that started up on the same first weekend that the Ottawa occupation did. These are the things that you say, okay, as we look at a whole range of potential outcomes in this, there might be a moment where we have to invoke the Emergencies Act. It wasn't seriously thought of because I will say certainly in my thinking right now, it was a fairly binary reflection. It was, oh, we might have to invoke the Emergencies Act. There was no reflection of what we would have to invoke the Emergencies Act to do. It was just understanding that if this situation continues and is unable to get under control by anything else, the federal government might have to give the provinces more powers, give police more powers, do something to put an end to this. So whenever we said, yeah, we're looking at all options, it would have been in the back of our minds, particularly because I think we're probably the first government that had ever actually leaned in carefully to maybe using the Emergencies Act as we did in the beginning of the pandemic. We dusted it off and had presentations at Cabinet around what the Emergencies Act was and how it was an update from the previous legislation that had existed before and how it was charter compliant. And yeah, because post 1982, a lot of things needed to change for the better in our country with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we got a crash course in the Emergencies Act and the consultations required and all the various steps of it 2 years before around the pandemic. As I had said during the consultations at that time with the premiers, I didn't think we needed to use it. I didn't think it was appropriate for us to declare a public welfare emergency. I believe the section is within the Emergencies Act that we would have invoked around the pandemic. But there were a lot of people calling for us to do it because it was obviously a national emergency, this pandemic, particularly in the early days of spring 2020. So we were somewhat versed in this legislation that had never been used. Seeing this particular public order situation, it was a reflection in the back of our minds, or my mind anyway, I can't speak for everyone, that maybe it would end up at this. But for the same reason we were loath to call an IRG too soon in the process, we knew that it wasn't ours to solve at this point, that there were still lots of things that the police of jurisdiction and various orders could and should be, orders of government could and should be doing to put an end to this. So it wasn't until, as you say, the IRG of February 10th, Thursday, that we said, okay, track one, what more can we do to empower police and public safety officials to put an end to these illegal occupations? What more resources can we spend with existing authorities? And track two was, what could we do that we would have to create new authorities for, whether it was through regulation, whether it was through passing emergency measures through the House, or whether it was using something like the Emergency Measures Act. And the key for me in that conversation was it was a shift from that sort of binary frame of no Emergencies Act or Emergencies Act. Because if you think about it, the Emergencies Act itself doesn't do anything except declare an emergency. It's that it enables government to bring in special temporary measures to deal with the situation. So the useful conversations around the Emergencies Act started on February 10th when I asked the question, okay, what are the extra tools that we would need to bring in, either through legislation or through regulation or in various ways, or through the Emergencies Act, that we don't actually have now? Or what would we do with the Emergencies Act if we brought it in that we can't otherwise do? And that reflection on, well, what would be the tools actually clarified and got the work going. Perfect example was we had heard consistently throughout that commercial tow truck drivers were not willing to come in and remove trucks. Well, the Emergencies Act perhaps could compel tow truck drivers to come and actually fulfill their contracts that are signed with cities to keep the streets clear of illegally parked cars. So that reflection was really the one that started then. And the tasking that I gave on that Thursday, that we would check in again on the Saturday at the next IRG, was, okay, come up with those tools that we could get at that would solve this. And then we'll look at, well, do we need the Emergencies Act to bring in these tools, or can we do it through another way, or can we convince a province to do it, or are there other ways of doing it? But let's figure out what are the things that would allow us to get this situation, which was out of control, back under control.
Okay, so that was essentially the discussion around the table on the 12th, I believe, and then the 13th was the big day in terms of deciding as a government whether you were going to take that first step and seriously consider invoking the Emergencies Act. Can you take us through, from your point of view, the chronology essentially of the 13th? We know there was an IRG meeting in the afternoon, I think it was 4:30, and the decision coming out of the IRG was to have a cabinet meeting in the evening and to discuss the potential invocation of the act. So how did those meetings play out?
Pendant le groupe de réponse d'incident.
During the IRG on that Sunday, we took a very close look at the measures that were proposed, the list of tools that we could give ourselves to help the police, the provinces, and not only just to get a hold of the situation and control it, but also to prevent them coming back. Because you called this the whack-a-mole, we saw that the protesters
We saw a lot of moles.
were very clever when it came to moving around and to have a presence here and then move to another place to give and to turn this into a big challenge for the police and the police response. So the concern, if we put all our resources in one place, we could maybe control that situation. But by doing that, another location would
what's up?
become vulnerable. Or
Good
once
evening.
we'd settled one situation, 2 days later they'd come back. So it was more of a question of, yes, to end the illegal occupations, but also to understand that they had to be maintained and they had to remain clear until the situation calmed down across the country. So during the Sunday meeting, we took a look at the various proposals, whether they be for the tow truck drivers or provisions for certain areas that were prohibited. You couldn't go there to protest there. You weren't allowed to bring children there. You weren't allowed to cross the border if your objective was to join a group. And there were measures that the banks could take, that they would be able to freeze the assets of the protesters while they were on the sites, while they were barricading, and to sort of persuade them to go home. So we talked about all these measures. We wanted to see what our options to turn those options into reality? Can we pass legislation in the House of Commons? Can we speed things up to have a unanimous consensus, or can we do it quickly? Can we encourage the provinces to use more of their tools? And at that moment, it was becoming pretty clear.
Right back to them, but we're going to cut out just for a moment because I can see in a discussion, I'm serious about the lying in French. Like, not even joking. Like, I've noticed, and I believe it's the strategy of the whole cabinet where everybody except Fraser's got pretty strong French. Most of them do. When they get a question that has really got them on their heels, they'll just, whether it was asked in English or French, they'll answer it in French. And I think the strategy behind that tactic is that fewer people are going to see the sound bite because there's more English Canadians than French Canadians. More people understand English than French. And so, okay, I don't mean to interrupt. We're going right back to it, but I'm not joking when I say they're answering in French, they're lying. Like, when they're answering in English, that's a joke. They're always lying too, and they always are. But in French, I swear, when they've got a very difficult question, notice that, especially Freeland. Like, she'll just start speaking French, and I think it's a tactic that they use.
Was so urgent, and a fear that it could get worse and go into a free fall, and that it was urgent to act. And the tool that we had to quickly bring in those specific tools was the Emergency Measures Act. The other part of the discussion,
Can't just invoke the Emergencies Act. You have to meet a threshold in order to invoke the Emergencies Act. And that brings us to one of the key questions. And
Is the
I'll ask
volume
you about
okay,
this
guys? Let me
several
know if the
times.
volume's too high
What
or low,
what I'm
or if it's
asking you
okay.
right now is
I
essentially
think
what
it's
you
okay.
can tell us about how that discussion played out in the IRG and the cabinet meeting. And I'll give you a little framing of it, which is, of course, we know that that the declaration of a public order emergency is premised on the existence of a threat to the security of Canada, as defined in the CSIS Act. And we know that CSIS, in the process of assessing the protests,
Thank you.
assessed that the protests did not meet that threshold. They did not constitute a threat to the security of Canada as defined in the CSIS Act. So this is one of,
As defined for the CSIS Act.
okay, please, over to you.
How smug he is. Oh my God, you could just punch it. Man. No,
The
no, you couldn't. No,
legislation,
I don't mean that. Well, I
in,
do, but
the
shouldn't say it.
80s that was built, brought in a definition of a national, a threat to national security, imported the words of the CSIS definition. That was
Hey,
a
Maria
handy
Lou.
definition that was already existing, and that's how we can define what a national threats to the security of Canadians would be. Those words in the CSIS Act are used for the purpose of CSIS determining that they have authority to act against an individual, a group, or a specific plot with, for example, a wiretap. That in order for them to take action in a particular situation, that threshold needs to be met of threats to national security. And actually it'd be useful if we could pull up part C of
Sure.
of
You know
the,
what, we have that in 1 second. I will get you document number. Okay.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Do you want it or do you not?
Yes, I do, sorry.
Okay. COM .50954, please. So here, I think this pastes together the three things. So national emergency, public order emergency, scrolling down, you'll see the reference to the CSIS Act, and there, keep scrolling, Mr. Clerk.
Yeah, just, no, sorry,
Nope,
keep it going.
Nope, keep going.
Yep. There we
There
go.
we go.
Good. So in order for CSIS to be able to do a particular operation, it has to meet this matter of threats to the security of Canada. And then they can go and do that wiretap. This definition within a declaration of public order emergency under the Emergencies Act is about the governor and council finding reasonable grounds that there are threats to the security of Canada sufficient to invoke the Emergency Measures Act. So both the context and the purpose is very different. The people doing the deciding, in the case of the CSIS Act, if this is met as a definition, it's CSIS itself that decides that this is met. There's checks and balances afterwards. But for the purpose of declaration of a public order emergency, it's the governor and council, cabinet and the prime minister making that determination. So the context within which we look at this definition is very different from the deliberately narrow frame that CSIS is allowed to look at. What inputs it can take in, what proofs it needs to establish this are very well prescribed so that CSIS can be, so that CSIS is responsible in what it does. Whereas the declaration of public order emergency is open to inputs, sure, from CSIS, but also from the RCMP, also some from transport, from immigration, from the whole of government, from the clerk, from the National Security Intelligence Advisor. So within threats to the security of Canada, what we had to determine was, does the situation going on across the country constitute a threat to the security of Canada? Yes or no? And then we looked at particularly C. Are there activities within Canada directed towards or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective? That was what we were looking at. Is that threshold met? Are there
Not
activities
even close, though, man.
supporting the threats or
can't pull
acts
the
of
trigger like
serious
that.
violence, a threat of serious violence
Lord.
for political or ideological goals? If that threshold was met in our reasoned opinion, then that part of invoking a public order emergency was met. The other part of it is, does it constitute a national emergency? And there's elements on that that I won't get into unless you ask me about. But I was very much focused on, was this bar hit? Yes or no, for the purposes of invoking the Emergencies Act. There has been a bit of back and forth at this commission on whether these words are different or can be read differently or are broader when they're used in a public order emergency than they're used for the CSIS. It's not the words that are different. The words are exactly the same in both cases. The question is, who's doing the interpretation, what inputs come in, and what is the purpose of it? And the purpose of it for this point was to be able to give us in special temporary measures as defined in the Public Order Emergency Act that would put an end to this national emergency.
Okay, so essentially you're saying that around the table that day,
Yes.
you were looking at the inputs that were given to you by officials and by the ministers and concluded that there was activities within Canada.
Threats of serious violence
Okay.
was the key ones.
And can you elaborate on what those threats were? What led to that conclusion?
And again, we went around the table with officials
Makes sense.
from
Faces.
all different agencies and heads of departments to talk about this. There was the militarization of vehicles, for example. We'd seen, weaponization of vehicles. We'd seen, cars ramming into police officers or other cars at Coots. We saw an incident like that in Surrey, I believe. We saw trucks used as potential weapons, certainly in Ottawa, with their presence and unknown interiors. There was the use of children as human shields deliberately, which was a real concern both at the Ambassador Bridge and the fact that there were kids on Wellington Street, that people didn't know what was in the trucks, whether it was kids, whether it was weapons, whether it was both. Police had no way of knowing those. There was presence of weapons at Coots, as we saw. There was a concern around weapons being stolen in Peterborough that we didn't know, about 2,000 guns that we didn't know where they had gone at that point. We later found out that they didn't go there, but that was a real concern that we had about what was happening to them. There were a number of others as well. There was the fact that police trying to enforce laws were met with active resistance, and a group of 30 police officers trying to interdict someone or arrest someone who was carrying a jerry can into the site in Ottawa got swarmed by 100 people, and they had to leave because there were threats to their safety.
Was it exactly 100, or was it 99,
or layers of danger that CSIS kept bringing up to us, that the presence of people promoting ideologically motivated violent extremism in the convoys had a danger of triggering not necessarily them to act, but lone wolf actors or people who could be radicalized to take actions that were violent. We saw increasandly counter-protests of people who were trying to take back their city, who were, for example, we all saw images of grandmothers standing in residential streets against massive trucks heading their ways to try and prevent them from coming to join the convoy. There were all these things that positioned or presented real threats of serious violence. And every input we were getting on that weekend at the IRG was that things were not getting better, things were getting worse. Even as it looked like there was a plan for the Ambassador Bridge to move forward, it looked like there was going to be a plan for Coots moving forward, there wasn't a sense that things were dissipating. On the contrary, we were hearing about Fort Erie, we were hearing about the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia, we were hearing about potential blockades in New Brunswick, we were hearing about potentials at La Colle, we were hearing more convoys and more supporters heading to different places to take action. There were things going on in BC and Surrey. Like, there was a sense that this was a broadly spread thing, and the fact that there was not yet any serious violence that had been noted was obviously a good thing, but we could not say that there was no potential for threats of serious violence, for serious violence to happen over the coming days. We were seeing things escalate, not things get under control.
Okay. You mentioned there that the Ambassador Bridge was on its way to resolution, in a sense, and Coots was on its way to resolution. One of the things that's come up in the evidence is that at this juncture, Ottawa could also perhaps have been said to be on its way, perhaps at an earlier stage, to resolution, in the sense that a plan, an integrated plan for policing and was coming together at that point. And that may not have been something that was clearly expressed on the 13th to the IRG and or cabinet. So first I wanted to ask you what your understanding of that situation was at the time.
First of all, from the beginning, from the approach of the very first weekend, we heard from various authorities and police of jurisdiction, don't worry, we got this. There's a plan. there's a plan, and for the second weekend, there was a plan. And we have a plan for this, and it's not going to happen, and we've got this, we're getting more resources. No, there's a plan. We kept hearing there was a plan. And even, I mean, we heard in testimony here that there was a plan on the 13th that the Ottawa Police Services pulled together. I would recommend people take a look at that actual plan, which wasn't a plan at all. It was a talk about using liaison officers to try and shrink the perimeter a little bit. But as you look at the annex for how the troops are deployed, how the police officers are deployed, what resources are going to be need, every annex is to be determined later, to be determined later. It was not even in the most generous of characterizations a plan for how they were going to end the occupation in Ottawa. When the plan did come together, and if someone wants to compare the supposed plan on the 13th with the actual plan on the 17th that the Ottawa Police Services pulled together, you see the crisp difference between these are the types of units we need, these are the resources we need, this is how we're going to do it, this is all the stagings of it on the 17th. It was not there on the 13th. But even beyond that, because I'm not fully aware how much of this is hindsight and how much of this was that general sense we got, that people continued to say, oh no, we're going to be able to get this under control. I think, and we're jumping ahead, but Jason Kenney was saying on the Monday morning in our First Minister's meeting, yeah, Coots is well on its way to being under control. We had heard that before, and there were fluctuations going on in the various sites across the country. It was not enough just to have a plan to clear a couple of lanes. It was getting the situation under control so as to prevent a recurrence
this
or
is
a
the dictator
restaging
stuff, man.
of
Like,
a protest.
we can't just have it
elsewhere.
functioning.
And that
We need
was
to
what
clear
was
them all
very
out.
clear from all
Like,
the
just
perspectives
full of it,
around
man.
the table.
Dangerous.
That there was not confidence that we were on a track to getting the national emergency under control in the coming days, that it was continuing to be a situation that was not being controlled by police, by officials.
Okay, so we will get to the First Minister's meeting, but let's just finish off on this point with the 13th. In a lot of the evidence that has come out before the commission, we see hesitancy and reluctance to invoke the Emergencies Act. So officials advising that this may make things worse, this may inflame tension, this may embolden protesters, et cetera. And we also obviously heard from Mr. Vigneault saying, and the CSIS assessment, that there was no threat to the security of Canada under the CSIS Act. And then we heard Mr. Vigneault say, but I still thought that the act was necessary, and I conveyed that to the Prime Minister. So can you tell us, was there consensus on the use of the act? What did you hear about whether or not people agreed with this interpretation, whether you should invoke the act?
Yes, there was consensus around the IRG table on Sunday the 13th. There is no question about it. And Director Vigneault's answer on that is absolutely consistent. CSIS, for example, wouldn't feel that they had the capacity to bring in a wiretap against one of the convoy organizers under the CSIS Act, because the tools that they have and the threshold they have to meet for what is a threat to the security of Canada, according to CSIS's evaluation, was not met. And that was something we heard from the very beginning. CSIS continued to say from the beginning of the protest, we haven't yet, under the CSIS Act, reached a level of threats to Canada. But the director of CSIS is also one of the national security advisors to me, and in looking at the frame and scope of the situation we were in,
when he's doing that, it's not a good sign. It's
in
a big
saying,
lie.
yeah, for the purposes of the
Big
CSIS
lie.
Act, this is not met. But for purposes of the Public Order Emergencies Act that the Governor and Council has to make a reasonable decision about, we feel that it is met. And that was the consensus from officials around the table. And again, it was about not even just sort of that binary, okay, do we declare the emergency or not? It's, do we declare a public order emergency so that we can bring in these specific measures? And as we went around the table on that, and my expectation is, and that was a virtual table, I believe, but my expectation is always, if you have significant disagreements, this is the time to speak up. There was no voice saying, hold it, we don't think you should do this, or I don't think you should do this, which does happen from time to time in cabinet meetings and in IRGs.
Grin, that smug smirk.
If someone had come up and said, okay, we don't think, us at Transport Canada, we don't think that we should invoke a public order emergency, I would have said, thank you, I would have taken that into account. But I didn't need unanimity or full consensus in order to make the determination in Governor of Council according to that we were moving forward. Obviously, it helped. And in this case, there was consensus around that table that invoking the Emergencies Act was what we needed to do.
And when you say that, are you speaking of the IRG in the afternoon or the eventual cabinet meeting in the evening?
I'm speaking of the IRG right now with where we went around the table with officials, but we did a similar thing that afternoon, that evening with the cabinet meeting. But I can talk about that if you.
Yeah, that's the segue. So please do. Tell us about the cabinet meeting.
Alors, à la rencontre du cabinet de ce soir.
So, on that evening, the cabinet met and we submitted the conditions that needed to be met to invoke the act. And we discussed at length of the tools that were needed and of the, I believe, 6 provisions that could bring to an end to this situation. 6 elements that could not be invoked by other means, but calling this law on emergency measures, this act. So there was a healthy discussion around the table. Every minister who wanted to express themselves did so. And I won't go into that detail, but I can say that there was consensus, clearly. Consensus that I had to move on and consult the premiers and move on to invoking the act. We did not decide on invoking the act then, but I could hear the reactions, just as I did before on the same day with the IRG meeting, that people felt comfortable enough and together enough on this issue. Yes, we could move on towards the possibility of invoking the act the next day.
Part of the discussion at the cabinet table as well.
Oui.
OK. Et après, et enfin, vous avez eu le même sort.
Yes, you made the same consensus then. Yes.
What we can loosely call Decision Day, February 14th. And I'm just going to try and lay out the chronology of that day and then ask you, first of all, whether that is the correct chronology of the day, and then ask you to speak to various parts of it. So the first ministers, the decision coming out of cabinet the evening before was to convene a first ministers meeting to have the obligatory consultation under Section 25 of the Emergencies Act before it could be invoked. And we know that late that night, an invitation was sent out to the premiers to that meeting. That invitation did not include the subject of the meeting, and we've heard some of your ministers and officials speak to why. But in any event,
That wasn't me.
Was held, I believe, at 10:15 the following morning on the 14th. Following that meeting, you had a call with opposition leaders, I believe, and a call with your own caucus.
No.
No.
The caucus call was before the first minister's meeting.
Thank you. Okay.
I wanted to make sure that we shared with our members of caucus who were going to be involved in very much a part of a government that has or would invoke the Emergency Measures Act. I wanted to let them know before premiers were consulted. I wanted to let them know that I was about to consult the premiers, but the sense was that caucus should hear it before the premiers heard about that.
That makes sense. Okay, so caucus call first, then first ministers meeting, then I think you spoke to opposition leaders, then around 3:41 p.m., I said around, but we actually know the minute, 3:41 p.m., you receive advice from the clerk. And that advice, as we know, is that the clerk recommends that you invoke the Emergencies Act, and shortly thereafter, there's a public announcement of it. So just unpacking that, starting with the caucus call briefly, but the focus of this will obviously be the first ministers meeting. Take us through that day.
The caucus call was informing them that I was about to go into a first ministers meeting in which I was going to present them with the fact that we were thinking about invoking the Emergencies Act. And I shared with them that these were the kinds of things that we would be giving police and various various officials and authorities which tools would be able to move forward with that. So I presented it. It wasn't a big discussion. I wasn't looking for consensus. There wasn't a lot of feedback. It was just informing them that we were taking this seriously and moving forward. And I dare say the response was very positive from our caucus. Then the first ministers meeting. As I'd mentioned earlier, this was not the first time I talked about the Emergencies Act with the premiers. I think as Ms. Telford talked about yesterday, I have had many
He is lying right now.
Over the course of the past 2 years to deal with the pandemic emergency.
He doesn't stop.
And we have always worked very constructively together. And for me, being able to sit down with them and highlight that we were seriously considering invoking the Emergencies Act in order to do the following things. And I wanted to hear from them. And then I went around the table across the country to hear from each of them on their reflections, their inputs, their concerns, their support, their disagreements in some cases. But really wanted to hear what it was that they were going to be, what their thinking was on this situation that would, by definition, affect all of them, on a situation that was, to a certain extent, affecting all of them. At the end of that meeting, I reached out to the opposition leaders, had conversations with them about what I was reflecting on doing, and asked for their support. And then started preparing for a potential announcement that afternoon as the note from the clerk came in, making the official recommendation to the government that we invoke the Emergencies Act.
Okay, so let me start with an initial question, taking you back to first thing in the morning. Had you made up your mind already?
No. I was a long way down the road of realizing that it was probably the path we needed to take, but I did not make up my mind until the note from the clerk was in front of me, and it was in black and white that the public service made a formal recommendation that I invoke the Emergencies Act. If I'd gotten to that point and they had said, no, we still don't think the threshold is met, it is possible that we wouldn't be here today, and I would not have invoked it, but I don't know. But the fact that when that note came in, I made that final decision with all the conversations, all the inputs, and all the feedback that I'd gotten from caucus, from from cabinet and from first ministers and opposition leaders and all the officials I'd talked to, that was when I made the decision.
So going back to the first minister's meeting, then we understand it lasted about an hour, and all of the premiers had a chance to voice their opinions and their concerns. But is there anything they could have said or done at that point to change your mind?
Absolutely. If someone had said, listen, I hear those 6 things you're planning on doing, you don't need them, because these are the tools we're going to use instead. We have the power, we're going to be able to, in Ontario, do this, and we're confident that that will end the situation in Ottawa and end the situation at potential blockades for law and keep us safe. You don't need to bring in compelling of tow truck drivers because we've figured out how to do it for good. We have a plan to put an end to this in a concrete and compelling way, because I'd heard a lot of plans up until that point. But if I had been convinced that other orders of government or any other law in Canada was sufficient to deal with this emergency, then we wouldn't have met the threshold, because part of the threshold for the Emergencies Act is and is unable to be dealt with under any other measures or laws in Canada. And if they had said convincingly, or enough of them had said, no, you don't need it because we have it under control, which is to a certain extent what they all said to me when I had this conversation with them around the pandemic. I said, listen, there's a lot of pressure for us to look at the Emergencies Act. Do we need to bring in the Emergencies Act? And they all said, no, don't bring in the Emergencies Act. We've got it under control. We're able to do this in our own jurisdictions, in our healthcare systems. We don't need to do it. Public order emergency is different than public welfare emergency, but that principle was there, and we didn't invoke the Act back in the spring of 2020. So yes, they could have said
have
things
that ring anymore to play
prevented
with.
me, that would have said, okay,
I guess
let's
he still
give it
probably
a few
has
more
the
days,
ring.
or let's not do this at all. They said lots of things, but that threshold that I had personally wasn't met.
And you mentioned, I mean, some of them did express opinions around the lines of, well, we got it under control here. This problem isn't really cropping up here, or it's cropping up here in a way that our law enforcement can deal with. So are you drawing a distinction there between, okay, the premiers may say it's under control here, but that doesn't mean it's under control everywhere. So they would have had to come to you with something that would have solved the big problem as you saw it? Is that?
I think there just would have been a sense that the measures I was proposing weren't going to be useful or effective. And what I heard on the contrary was concerns that we'd shared that this might inflame the protesters to declare a public order emergency and bring in martial law, which was one of the concerns, or that they would interpret it as that. Of course, it wasn't martial law, and it did not suspend people's fundamental rights and freedoms. But it at the same time,
But it did.
they expressed these concerns, which we had shared, but I was balancing off against, okay, there is a danger of further inflaming the situation, but the situation was already pretty inflamed, and my concern was if we continue to not do anything, are enough citizens going to start counter-protesting and taking things into their own hands at various places across the country that we do get into dangerous, violent situations. Even Premier Moe, I believe, we could pull it up, but I think people have seen it a few times, highlighted that he didn't have any real, that the 6 elements we had seemed reasonable enough, but he was in disagreement with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. That those 6 elements we should maybe move forward with in some way, but without doing the Emergencies Act. That was something that we looked at trying to do as well. But it was clear that in order to do those, bring in those tools, the Emergencies Act was the vehicle that was created for that purpose so that we could respond to a national emergency. Jason Kenney, I believe, said, I'm not going to quibble with the use of the Act, but we don't need it here in Alberta. And that was something that came out a number of times, even by those who were supporting it, said, yeah, you do what you need to do. Don't think we need it here, but I know this is a situation where you should probably do it. Or can you not do it in my jurisdiction and just do it for Ontario? And that was certainly something that I had reflected on, and certainly reflected on further through that conversation. But the reality is there were pop-ups and troubling reports right across the country that we were getting from all of our various inputs. There was a financing of these convoys that was coming from every corner of the country and internationally. These were things that were generalized across the country and therefore required a use of the Emergencies Act. Par exemple, le Premier ministre Legault a exprimé.
Oh,
Premier
the
Legault
big
expressed
lies.
some concern.
Now he's talking
He
about
didn't
unicorns being
have
real
the
and
RCMP
free heat pumps
suddenly
being available for all Canadians, and
take over all the police interventions
so
and
full
operations
of
in
it,
Quebec
guys.
when he thought
I try not to
he
swear on
didn't
here,
need
but
that. And I was
it
able
can be
to
heard
reassure
with him
And it's
sometimes.
something that I actually
You can.
incorporated in my communication subsequently, that it was there to be used if necessary. But if, for instance, there was a blockade at L'École and the SQ is perfectly able to deal with it, like they responded very well at the second weekend at a attempted convoy in Quebec City. The RCMP was only there to be a support if necessary. And that was the framework. So it was a very useful conversation. And I heard a lot of points of view. And it was a good thing for me to be able to hear them, even with different opinions, and just to reassure what I was doing.
Smug look,
This
look
entire
at
part.
it's
The
smug look.
last question I want to ask you about that day, Prime Minister. So at 3:40, when you received the decision note from the clerk, we call it the invocation memo. Technically, it's a decision note. And presumably you read it.
Yes.
Okay. And was there anything in it that surprised you? Was
Look at
that the
his- look
advice
at
you
his
were
smug little
expecting to
face.
get from the clerk, or was it?
It was the advice that was consistent with the consensus around the table the day before at the IRG. The clerk and the National Security and Intelligence Advisor and the deputy clerk and all the heads of departments and agencies had a chance to weigh in on the various measures and on the invocation. And there was a clear consensus coming out of there that this is what we should do. But it was a big thing, not a small thing, to have the head of the public service formally recommend the invocation of the Emergencies Act and the declaration of a public order emergency. It's not something that had ever been done in Canada before. It was certainly not something that we undertook to do lightly. And as a Prime Minister, I get to sign off and agree with these notes, or in
My
some
God,
cases
you
disagree
guys,
with
like
them.
he's
And that was
dragging
a
me down.
moment
He's
that
wearing
I
me out.
Took with the weight of the decision I was about to take. And I reflected briefly on, first of all, the reassurance that it gave me that the entire system, all the inputs in the system had come up to the clerk of the Privy Council, the top public servant in Canada, impartial, professional public service, making the recommendation to move forward on this was essential to me. But I also reflected on, okay, What if I don't sign it? What if I say, okay, we now have advice from the professional public service to invoke a public order emergency. And I decide, you know what? Let's give it a few days. Where the professional public service had made a determination that the thresholds were met, that the use of it was appropriate and, responsible, and the measures were the right ones that we were going to put in it. And I said, no, you know what? Let's wait and see another few days, another week to see if we really need to do it. First of all, what if the worst had happened in those following days? What if someone had gotten hurt? What if a police officer had been put in a hospital?
What if
when
you
I
took
had an
away
opportunity
the
to
rights
do
of
something,
Canadians and froze their
I
bank
waited,
accounts and put them in
and
jail
we had the unthinkable happen over the coming days.
because you thought you
even
could
though
get away
there was
with
all
it?
this warning that it was possibly coming.
Goodness gracious.
I would have warned that in a way that we would certainly be talking about in a forum such as this. But more than that, the responsibility of a prime minister is to make the tough calls and keep people safe. And this was a moment where the collective advice of cabinet, of the public service, and my own inclination was that this was a moment to do something that we needed to do to keep Canadians safe. And knowing full well that this was an inevitable consequence of me signing, I agree, on this note, I was very comfortable that we were at a moment where this was the right thing to do. And we did it. And it is a certain amount of comfort that, first of all, the system is working as it should. That people who are defending civil liberties are able to say, you
not how
really
it's
should be
supposed to
careful
work,
about
though,
doing
bro.
this. Maybe you
Come
shouldn't
on.
have done it. That we have a system pushing back on this because it's a big thing, not a small thing to do this. But that also we were able to solve the situation with it. That there was no loss of life. There was no, serious violence. That we were able to
Dude, he took away the rights of
neighborhoods back
Canadians,
under control,
and they'll do it again the first chance he
border
gets. They're already
services
saying that they
opened,
still
and,
think they made the right
there
decision,
haven't
even though
been
this Inquisition said they were
a
guilty.
recurrence of these kinds of illegal occupations.
It is an issue, guys.
Since then, I'm not going to pretend that
Scared
it's the
for
only thing that could
Canadians.
have done it, but it did do it, and that colors the conversations we're having now with the fact that these could be very different conversations, and I am absolutely, absolutely serene and confident that I made the right choice in agreeing with
It's
the
not
application.
a smart thing to say, bud.
Mr. Commissioner, definitely a good time for a break.
Okay, so we'll take the morning break. We'll take 15 minutes, please.
The commission is in recess for 15 minutes. La commission levée pour que...
All right, guys. So I can't go for much more than 2 hours at any given point. Like, we will be back. There is more to watch. That is tough to watch. That's a lot of Trudeau for everybody to watch all at once in one sitting too. I'd recommend like having a glass of wine or a drink of water, doing some exercise, walking your dog, something like to get that out of your head, because he can frustrate you. Like, again, my mood will go back to being happy-go-lucky in a couple of minutes, but he is tough to watch because I get this bad feeling anytime somebody's lying straight to my face and I know it, and they feel like I think they even know that I know that they're lying, but they just continue to do it because they think they can get away with it. I'm not down with that feeling. I don't like that at all. But I do love this group. Like, it's growing too. It's nice to see. Share this with somebody. You probably have a friend that would enjoy like picking on the politicians, whatever. And we can go pretty hard. Well, we stay away from some areas, but like this group is great. So we don't have to worry about that. But yeah, for now, I've got to use the washroom, and I'm getting pretty hungry. Probably got to get out there and shovel tonight too. There's supposed to be another storm tonight, back-to-back storms. What you gonna do? Anyhow, I'm Ehren. Thank you all for watching. Like I could try to say all the names. There's a lot of people that were interactive tonight, and I appreciate everybody. I try to say hello to everybody when I see them pop in the room, and I try to respond to try to be as interactive. It's a work in progress. Like if you've been watching the channel for any amount of time, you can see it's slowly improving in different ways. Anyhow, that's it. I'm Ehren. Hope you've had something healthy to eat today and going to be able to stay warm tonight. We'll be back with more videos. I don't know. We might make another couple tonight. Who knows? Just got to use the washroom and grab something to eat. It's a blast in here. Thank you all. Take care and catch you next time. Looking forward to it. Have a good night.